the big upsells of scuba diving for many people is the fact that you and everyone around you can't talk to one another for about an hour or so whilst you're on a dive. So people just can't talk to you during a dive unless you're both on full face masks and you actually have communications fitted. So equipment manufacturers are working on digital devices so that you can kind of communicate underwater, like sending text messages in the water, but until they come up with something effective, we have to stick to hand signals to communicate underwater. Hand signals can be easy to just make up on the spot. If you don't actually know the hand signal for something, then you can just have a quick game of charades between you and your buddy. And if they don't really get it, then you can always just write it down on a slate or just tell them after a dive. So, I mean, I once had a kid swim up to me on a Discover Scuba with like a toy orca in his hands. He kind of pointed to it and then to me. I didn't really know what he was on about because we were just in a swimming pool. There weren't like any orcas behind me. But later on he told me that he'd seen my Sea Shepherd's shirt from earlier and he recognized the logo and he was like, orca, yeah, the hand signal underwater didn't mean much to me, but I didn't really expect him to know the hand signal for like Sea Shepherd or something like that. Even I had to look that up. Most scuba diving hand signals are actually based on actual sign languages like ASL, and whilst we do have some universal hand signals across the globe, you can also come across some quite regional ones, especially when it comes to fish ID. But even the fundamentals can sometimes change, so it's important to spend a little bit of time with your buddy so that you're both on the same wavelength when it comes to talking underwater, because you can have literal different languages when it comes to hand signals. Now, we're not particularly elitist here at Simply Scuba, but on that note, here are the best dive signals to use. Numbers are quite important to get right, obviously, and there are quite a few different ways to convey numbers that I've come across, especially when it comes to tank pressure. So for recreational diving, especially if you're diving on bar gauges, then you've probably been taught T for 100 bar, a closed fist for 50, and then each finger after that is a 10. So 170 bar would be 170. But I've known some divers who use the same signals, that kind of T, that actually means something different, so you can get just wires crossed sometimes and it gets confusing. And a closed fist near your chest can mean just low on air or kind of stop in some circles, so yeah, messages can just be muddled. Personally, I prefer this one-hand approach to numbers where upright fingers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then sideways 6, 7, 8, 9, and then that's for 0. So 170 will be 170. But yeah, that kind of spells everything out, and it's much less ambiguous than sort of some other systems. And this is pretty much what PSI divers use anyway, because they can have four-figure pressures to convey. It also leaves one hand free, so if you're holding onto a reel or a torch, you don't have to wave it around whilst you're signaling and just kind of blind everyone trying to figure out how to make a T. Some divers point out that 5 or 5 is a lot like stop, but realistically, in context, it's rare that you're going to say that you've got 100 and stop 20 bar. No, that's not really going to happen. And sometimes, basically, someone's not going to be yelling at you, 5, when really they're trying to say stop. But who knows? So, as with all hand signals, just kind of take your time and don't kind of rush through them, make it really obvious. And on the other side, if you don't understand something, then just ask them to repeat it, just so that you're sure. And also repeat, that's different in different countries. If there was any hand signal that was so synonymous with scuba diving, it's the classic OK. It's different from a 0 because your fingers are upright, and it's different from a 3 because your fingers are kind of apart and you're actually showing the palm of your hand. You can see the OK symbol just all over the place, both in and out of the water. It's on t-shirts, it's on like dive centers logos. The OK symbol is just everywhere with scuba diving, and you will most likely use it on every single dive, but divers can also get a bit blasé about it and just kind of throw it up whenever. Too many divers just throw up the OK signal without even thinking. It's more of a reflex at that point. So some divers, to make sure that the other diver is actually paying attention and kind of considering if they're actually okay, they throw up the OK symbol and then a number. And then the buddy replies OK, and then that number, the 2, plus 1 or 2. So whatever you've agreed upon before the dive. This kind of makes sure that they're actually paying attention and not just seeing an okay and replying without thinking. And when you say that you're okay, actually think about it. Don't just reflectively say it. Just spend some time, check on your air, check your NDL, and then say, yeah, you know what, I'm okay. And if you're not okay, try to maybe obvious what's wrong. Too many people just sort of give the, oh, there's something wrong, but then leave it at that. Try and point to what's wrong so that your buddy knows what's wrong. Even if it's just that you don't understand your dive computer, point to it and kind of show it to your buddy so that they can see, because they might be able to explain it or at least adjust their dive profile to what your dive computer is saying. Fish are also important to know your hand signals so that you can tell your buddy what you're actually looking at and whether it's important enough to actually swim over and look. I mean, once I was leading a dive up in Norway and I heard a noise behind me, so I turned around, kind of swam back, mildly panicked because of the noise he'd made, and he's like gestured down into this crack just to point out a starfish. If he'd had kind of told me that there was a starfish down there, I'd probably be a little more relaxed when kind of swimming over to him. By knowing what you're sort of looking for as well, you can act appropriately. If it's a scorpion fish or a stonefish, then you know not to look that close to what they're pointing at, and that you're just looking for something, a fish that basically just looks like an ugly rock. But if you're looking for a nudibranch or something, you know to look for something small, like a little colourful slug. So if someone told you to kind of look in this hole for something they'd seen, then you'd rather know beforehand if there was a moray eel inside before you poke your head inside, basically looking for, I don't know, a cute little octopus or something hiding inside. No, it's actually a moray eel that will come out. Most fish hand signals are made to look a little bit like they're describing, like turtles, kind of shark, lionfish, and kind of octopus. Others are a bit more of a kind of sounds like, such as triggerfish and cornetfish. Tuna fish looks a bit like a can of tuna. Grouper, it's a bit like groper, but grouper. Snapper. But it's important to know the basics of kind of what can be in your area, because if someone kind of does that to you at a dive site, yeah, you know what they're trying to convey. On night dives and even in poor visibility, your torch can actually be a very useful communication tool, both actively and passively. If you're diving along and you can see your buddy's torch beam sort of just in front of you, then you know that they're kind of nearby and they're following you and that everything's okay. If it starts to like wave around, then you know to kind of turn around to see if everything's okay or not. And if you don't see it at all, you only see your own torch beam, then you know that you may have become separated and it's time to start looking for them. Communicating with torches is actually easier than hand signals in sort of certain circumstances, especially at distance, because you can really easily get your buddy's attention by crossing your light beam over theirs. You kind of have to cross the streams. I know Ghostbusters taught us never to do that, but it's actually quite good in scuba diving. It's a great way of getting their attention because you know they're looking at the torch beam, and if you cross over it, you basically grab hold of them and draw them away. You can throw any hand signals towards your buddy in the daytime, and if they're not looking at you, then they're never going to see it. But if you have a torch, then you can actually get their attention really, really easily. A quick circle of your torch basically tells them that you're okay, that's your kind of okay signal, and you can actually point to things much easier with your torch beam so that you don't have to get too close to this, I don't know, venomous animal. More complicated signals that you can't do with a torch can still be done with your hands. You just shine the torch on your hands. It's that simple. Other signals that I find quite useful are kind of stick to the wall or stay close to the bottom. They're quite handy, especially if you're in a current, so that's current, so that you don't get washed away. If you're nice and close to the wall, it kind of slows down that current. Boat is always useful so that you can ask sort of which way is the boat. That way you know, oh, is that our boat? And you're not going to climb up on the wrong boat. I've done that before. 3-minute safety stop at 5 meters. You should always end a dive with a 5-meter safety stop, and that's why we use this signal. You have the sort of 5-meter ceiling, and then you stay there for 3 minutes, so that's why it's a 3-minute safety stop. Deco, if you ever do go into deco, it's important that you can sort of say how many minutes of deco you still have left, and if someone shows you that, you know what it means. Some say deco like this, which is shaka, which means no worries, everything's okay, hakuna matata. It can also mean pipefish, so I do deco like that. Switch is quite handy if you're diving on multiple tanks and you're going to change to what you're breathing on, or if you want a guideline that you should switch positions. That can be quite useful. I had a guy come up to me and he's like, switch. He wanted to breathe on my octo because it was a rare sort of vintage octo, and he's like, oh, okay, switch. Line, kind of cross fingers if you're talking about like strings and line, and then spool. Very unimaginative, it kind of stays on the same thing. And entanglements, kind of a figure of 8 but across fingers, they're also good to know, and they're all fairly similar. Anything to do with like string or lines is just crossed fingers, and then if you're winding it, it's a reel. If you're entangled in something, that's quite important to know, so you can tell your buddy, oh, I'm entangled in something behind me. And there are just plenty more out there. And when you get into touch communications for sort of cave diving, when visibility disappears, things can get much more intimate, but maybe I'll demonstrate those in another video. I'll tell you later, Shaun. But what's your favourite diving signal? I know what Shaun's one is, but I can't show that here because kids might be watching. Anyway, thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving. We used to do it to divers, and you'd kind of like point it to them, and they're like, oh, you'd like swim behind them and just very gently push their tank towards it, and they get too close and they're like, yeah, trying to swim back. Destroy delicate wildlife, or you know, your dangly bit can be destroyed. So, sorry, Shaun. So keep them trim, keep them nice and close to your body so that you're not actually destroying things. So let's take a close look at scuba divers' dangly bits and the worst hashtag flappy snag hazards when scuba diving.